Welcome everybody to our second edition of Faust. We are right in the thick of things now. Things are moving. We're going to start with a brief overview and intro of the main themes, and then hopefully I won't bore you too much, and then I'll just open the floor to a few of our regulars, and then from there we'll open it up to everybody to share what you've learned, any questions you have along the way. And I think it'll be a very interesting discussion because there's a lot in this reading for today, and we may actually we'll see how it goes. But if we don't cover everything, we're not going to rush it. We'll let it spill over into the next session because I want to make sure that we cover all of this because it's such a fascinating and dense section of the book that I want to make sure that we all feel comfortable that we've given it enough time. So with that, I am going to, let's see, I guess I'm going to share my screen. I'll just talk. I have on my screen, I have kind of a guide. So whenever I read, what I try to do is first just take notes, and then I go back and try to sort it all by some sort of top level classification of what are the main things that are happening. So in my mind, this section introduces all the main characters of the play, starting from God and the angels, and then to Mephistopheles. Then we of course meet Faust, we meet Wagner. So all the main characters essentially are introduced in this section. So I guess we want to just take a few moments to go over some of the basic things. Hopefully you probably are familiar with some of these, but I'll just remind you in case you aren't. So we start out with a prologue in heaven, where we meet the three archangels. The three archangels are Michael, Gabriel, and Raphael. Two of them are you can find them in the Protestant Bible, and then Raphael is the one that is part of the Catholic Bible, the Apocrypha. But all three of them are mentioned in the scriptures in a kind of a larger sense. And then we meet God. And then right after meeting God, we meet the devil. So very interesting setup. And of course, it is reminiscent of the book of Job. If you have read the book of Job, it's you will immediately see the parallels there, because it's exactly the same type of setup where you have God, you have the angels, and then devil comes to the meetup essentially, and the way God asks the devil in Job, "Have you considered my servant Job?" And the way God asks Mephistopheles, "Do you know Faust?" is so so easily juxtaposed that it is almost like that you don't need any further intuition to see that Goethe actually takes that exact theme and then runs with it as a setup for the rest of the story. Now, while the book of Job is a close parallel to the scene, there are some notable differences. And the differences have to do with this distinction of what we talked about last time, which is this idea of the Faustian man versus the medieval or the Magian man. And Job is very much in the medieval Magian tradition, whereas Faust is firmly in a different tradition. And you can see that from the type of interaction that he has with Mephistopheles versus the type of interaction that Job has with God and with his friends there. So just a couple of points on that. The name Mephistopheles is interesting. Right from the start, we have one of these interesting mysteries about Faust. Nobody actually knows what is the proper etymology of Mephistopheles. The last part, Teufel, that's German for devil, and we see that right there in the play, mentioned several times. But the first part, Mephis, is not as clear, and some people speculate that it's coming from Greek, and that Goethe basically created this name by taking me, which is the Greek prefix for negation, and phos, which is the Greek word for light, so kind of anti-light. And there is some of that in Mephistopheles. As we meet him, he talks immediately about light and darkness and his opposition to that. So that could be a derivation, but it's interesting that nobody actually knows for sure where this name comes in. It's probably just an invention of Goethe's. So we have the angels, we have the devil, and we have God. And of course, very interestingly, the picture of God that we have is very different from some of the other classical works that we've read. For instance, Dante never actually has any kind of dialogue or any kind of interaction with God. God is presented as this transcendent being. He's in these wheels of within wheels, fire, completely transcendent. And here God is talking, he is interacting, he is very much kind of a very approachable type of persona. And even Mephistopheles says, I need to keep up with the old man. He's very humane even to the devil, which is kind of the comedic part of the scene. It starts out very idealistic, but then it ends on this comedic note, which again goes back to our opening introduction, where we had the talk with the director, the comedian, and the poet. And as we read, I think you can trace kind of where the poet comes in, and then where the comedian comes in, and then the director kind of merges the two threads. And right in the opening scene in the prologue, we have this merging between the very idealistic, very noble song of the archangels who are praising the creation and all the mysteries of creation, and then you have this the devil who comes in and starts kind of raining on their parade and saying, well, yeah, things are not as great on the earth actually, and not much going on there. So it's very reminiscent of the kind of the setup, right? You have the idealistic, the comedic, and then kind of real life. And then the other part of it, the other strand of it is Faust, and we meet him right after that. But before we get to him, I want to just mention briefly the bet between the God and the devil. And the bet is very simple. Basically, it's a bet that if the devil has his way with Faust, he will be able to corrupt him. God says, no, you're not, and the bet is on. So basically, it's the same thing as in Book of Job, but in Job, the bet is that God is protecting Job, and therefore Job is serving God for the sake of getting this protection. Whereas in Faust, it's not about protection so much, it's more about just man being, having sort of like this ability to know what's right and wrong on his own, essentially. And then devil says, no, if you give me freedom to tempt him and to show him different aspects of life, I will corrupt him. God says, you're on. So that's the setup, that's the function of the prologue in heaven. And then we move into actually meeting Faust. And Faust is, right from the start, very, I would say, a character that's very easy to identify with. He's a person who is learned, he is sophisticated by any standard. He's like a scientist, essentially, a person of wide learning, but at the same time, he's very much dissatisfied with life, very tormented, very, I would say, unbalanced. And that is such a good picture of this whole idea of Faustian man, a person in the Faustian age, a person who both wants everything and yet has this inherent instability about him. and his life is kind of a mess, and he's completely dissatisfied, and he's searching for answers, and he rejects academia as the source of these answers and learning in general. And he wants to now, since the traditional routes have failed him, he wants to turn to the supernatural, and he turns to the spirit of the earth first, and then he turns to the devilish aspects of the supernatural after that. So that's kind of the setup. I do want to go back for a couple of things. First, to just, I guess, underline certain things about this kind of the worldview that Goethe presents to us. So we talked about God, we talked about the devil a little bit. I do want to go back to this idea of the devil as Goethe presents him. So he's also a very kind of a congenial character. He's not at all presented as some sort of villain. He's presented like that in Milton. He's presented like that in Dante, but he's not presented like this in Goethe at all. He's presented as a kind of almost like a humane character. He says, you know, I almost wish I didn't have to torture man. He's already tortured. Like, I feel bad for torturing him. And you know, remarks like these make him very kind of appealing. At the same time, he's obviously a very powerful figure, but he's brutally honest about a lot of things. So he's very attractive. I would say this whole picture that we have of God as a kind of approachable character, devil as the sort of congenial, a person that you wouldn't mind having a beer with. I would say it's a very right there in stride with the rest of kind of the romantic movement that tries to bring in all the supernatural into the world, and tries to maybe somehow incorporate supernatural into something that's understandable to us. And the way the devil behaves, and the way that God behaves, and having all these bets, and kind of talking to the devil at all, which again is, when you think about it, why would God even talk to the devil? That kind of doesn't make sense if there's a feud between them, as the kind of the more traditional approach would suggest. And yet there they are, conversing and having bets and arguing. And anyway, it's very interesting setup. The other part about it is this view of man that coming from Mephistopheles, and then expounded in two main personas that we have, Faust and Wagner. So man is presented as, well, the devil calls him kleine Gott der Welt, little God in the world, kleine Gott der Welt. But then he obviously says it sarcastically, because he then says that man is merely a beast with this sort of spark of divinity in him, and that spark of divinity is actually the cause of all these problems. And what is this spark of divinity? Well, it's his ability to think, his rational prowess. And in fact, instead of helping him, it's only causing him suffering. So the picture of man, as it emerges from Mephistopheles' point of view, is this person who is, or being that is both earthly and heavenly, very conflicted about these two sources that are irreconcilable, it seems. And then sarcastically, he also calls him a grasshopper, in German Zikaden, like a cicada, which I thought was kind of humorous. And the idea being that a grasshopper doesn't really stay in one place. It's constantly jumping around. And I thought, when I was reading this, I thought about the idea, well, you know, you meet people and you say, how are you doing? And a lot of times this is a new thing, but I'm kind of guilty of it myself. And a lot of people will say, oh, busy. You know, that's the description of our lives, as if there was some sort of like benefit in being busy as a virtue. But this busyness is what Mephistopheles notes as the striving that doesn't really get you anywhere, just jumping around as a grasshopper. The other word that is constantly employed both by Faust and Mephistopheles is worm, Wurm in German. So this idea of man as a worm. Yet a worm that aspires, as Mephistopheles again says, for fairest stars and from the deep and from lust from deepest earth. So kind of this, again, this idea of infinite, the idea of infinite yearning that is causing this conflict. So Faust, he wants it all. He wants the fairest stars, you know, the most idealistic, most beautiful, schön ist stern in German, or the deepest, you know, lust, the deepest, you know, kind of human experience in all its visceral ugliness, I guess, or expressiveness, brutality, even perhaps. So this is what Faust wants as we read his monologue. And then man is presented as this being that is torn between these two impulses, the heavenly and the earthly. And obviously Mephistopheles steps right in and starts tempting Faust to say, okay, well, I'm going to show you all of this, you know, all these experiences that you want, the fairest stars, the deepest lusts. I got it. So let's, I guess, talk briefly about the nature of the bet between Faust and Mephistopheles, which is different than the bet between Mephistopheles and God. The bet between Faust and the devil is that the devil will not be able to provide an experience which will be like the ultimate experience, right? That's the famous line from Faust is, "Stop, oh moment, you're so fair," right? As soon as Faust, you know, Faust basically says, as soon as I say that, as soon as I experience something that is the ultimate experience and I don't need anything else, and I feel like this is the summation of my being, you got me. And I guess we can talk about this, whether or not this bet even makes sense. What is this bet really about? But it's very interesting. So we got that going on. We got the worldview of God, of the devil, of man striving, and then you have Faust as kind of the epitome of that, and then you have Wagner. Now, what a character that is! Wagner is this epitome of scholar, kind of the person of academia, but really like a stale person of academia, I would say, a person who is constantly obsessed with the form, but never with the essence. And he overhears Faust talking to the earth spirit, and he thinks Faust is reciting some Greek tragedy. And he wants to come in and take lessons from him in rhetoric and in a way to express himself. But Faust says, no, if you don't speak from the heart, it's pointless. And but Wagner doesn't get it. He's all about tradition. He's all about these stale formulas and reciting things from memory and making sure that he's got everything kind of dotted, and in a very medieval, I would say, very scholastic person who I think epitomizes kind of the staleness of academia at the time when Faust is leaving it. Faust is ready to say goodbye, and Wagner is all enthralled in it. And the two are kind of like, they show the opposition of science and I guess some of the aspects of science that are barren and maybe not really keys to a fruitful life or satisfied life. So that's the setup. I think I'm going to leave it at this for now, and I will pass the baton to Doug. And then after that, Joe, do you have a few words to say after? Okay, perfect. So Doug, go ahead, and then Joe, and then I think after that we'll just open it up to everybody. So if you have something, you can maybe start thinking about that. And as always, just type in the exclamation point in the chat, and I will try to call on you. Doug, go ahead.
Yes, I'm not sure where to start. I'm going to try to condense this down into something really fairly short, because there are so many directions this could go in, and there are the themes, but then there's the sort of echo of themes and how they, earth, air, water, fire, and how that repeats, and how you know, as an example, you know, certain figures like Mephistopheles is associated with observing humanity, which is dominated by three of the elements, and he has some power over fire. But I mean, it constantly, the variations on certain motifs that come up. And I want to hit one primarily, and that's this section, the action, or in some translations, it's called the deed. And what the act is, what the actor is, what the action is, what the field of action is, which I think are a framework Kenneth Burke kind of identified. But that idea, that constantly comes from this. And there are so many theater people that Goethe is referring back to, the Greeks and the Roman comedies probably, you know, with some of his characters and some of the sense of life. But action in the poetics, tragedy is the imitation of an action. It's not the imitation of a character. It's not the imitation of a theme or a thought, but it's primarily an imitation of an action. And I'll tell you, you can meditate on that for months and years and not get to the roots of what that is. I had two great teachers at theater school and Cal Arts, one in the film school, one in theater, who just hammered the idea of action into me in terms of as an actor, but also as a writer, director. And I'll tell you, it took about 6 months for me to really understand what these two men coming from two angles were actually getting at. And Goethe is totally about that. The action of life, not the dry dust details that Wagner, you know, I've heard it pronounced different ways, but depending on the productions, but his assistant, his scholar is totally pedantic, as Phil said, and it's just dry as dust knowledge. The other thing is that actions build into counteractions, build into variations on actions to get around the counteractions. And those go back to the Greeks, where there's the agon, there's the protagonist and the antagonist. And agon means a wrestler, or an act of wrestling. So you have one wrestler, you have a counter wrestler. So these, and I just heard a great Latino playwright talk about that he wrestles with himself as even one kind of Latino, which wrestles with another kind of Latino that lives within him. And he's done adaptations of Oedipus and all these other plays. So the Greeks and the Romans, maybe less so, the Romans really bought into spectacle, which is sort of what we do with the Marvel movies. But the root of the action and what that means, in the poetics, the imitation of an action, one of the introductions by Francis Ferguson, who was a great theater person, said that action is a movement of spirit, usually from inside to outside. And we brought this up during Dante as well. It's a movement of spirit. Sometimes it's from outside to inside, like a Deus ex machina, where God comes down and slaps everybody around and knocks some sense in them. But usually the movement comes from inside. Sometimes it comes from the blood spilled in the ground that demands vengeance, like an Oedipus. That's a blood that's spilled that cries for the truth of that killing to come out, which then Oedipus pursues the action of discovering the truth of that killing, even when it costs his own power. And that's why he's a hero. So this idea of what action you're tied to, is it a good action or is it a bad action? Or is it a kind of weak academic action that is just spinning in circles and not really moving into the world? So actions build to counteraction, sub-scenes, so that a play is actually a form of vectors. So it's sort of why they're hard to read until you get the idea that this little scene or fragment of a scene is a certain action, which in the next moment may be completely contradicted. Like in Shakespeare, no sooner does a character make an oath that within half a page to 2 pages later, he's put in a situation where he has to break the oath he just made. You know, in the case of the Duke in Othello, he says, I will pursue whoever kidnapped your daughter right to the edge, and I will punish him to the full extent of the law. Then he finds out it's his greatest general who has married this old man's daughter. And he has to sort of eat his words and say, well, I can't really destroy him because we need him in the battle we're about to fight. You know, so the action or the intention and the counter intentions And the simulation of actions, is another important thing. That the devil is really friendly with Faust, but as soon as he leaves, he starts to show his cards. It's like Iago and Othello as well. It's like, I'm your best friend. You can confide in me. And then this. So this play is so influential in the actions it embedded, and in all the other playwrights. It influenced German playwrights, but playwrights around the world afterwards. Because the action, in a way, is that spirit, that Geist, that zeitgeist, that sort of, they talk about the zeitgeist of the period. So Goethe was really trying to go, okay, what are we doing here? Like the different kinds of men that Phil was talking about. But the fact that he says, in the beginning was the word, within this is like less than a sonnet. He basically says, in the beginning was the word. No, words are not very powerful. That's not right. In the beginning was the mind. No, I don't know. The mind is like completely quirky. In the beginning was power. And then within 2 lines, he says, no, in the beginning was the action, the deed. And so that's something worth meditating on, is what are the actions we bring to life? The whole through line of the section we just finished reading, and I'll stop here because I think it's enough for now. Or the other thing I'll say, there's the world of light and the angels, and the world of dark, the devils, and earth is a world of alternating light and dark. So that's part of it. But and there are other references that the devil shows up as a black dog. I think even people like Winston Churchill, when he went into his depression, said he was taking the black dog for a walk. That's influenced culture in a lot of interesting ways. And so a lot of people who are philosophers and rooted in this, when they tell you, I'm out walking the black dog, it means they're depressed. And I have a range of friends who kind of use that sort of shorthand for that. But the through line of this is to get out of the study and into the world at large. And it takes about 4 or 5 complicated scenes for Faust to get out of the study. He goes out to the streets, he goes by the gate, but that's not really quite going into the world. It's like flirting with, young people who are drinking in bars and at a party. And he goes down there, but then he comes back and he suddenly comes up with a lot of things that give him comfort, and then they go dry. They fall apart, they go dry. So that's a beat. He comes back, oh, yes, I was out in the world and it's wonderful. And I know God and I can see it. And then every time he mentions God, this dog growls from behind the stove. And basically he pulls him out of hiding by actually finally referencing Jesus Christ, and the dog goes ballistic, and he finally realizes, oh, this is not a dog, this is something else. So those are actions, counteractions, savoring moments, and then the moment goes dry. That's a lot of what this is about. We think we found the truth, we think we found love, we think we found this, and then it goes dry. So what do you depend on? So I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you, Doug. I want to say just a few things before I pass this on to Joe. As far as this soliloquy that Faust has about in the beginning was the word versus in the beginning was action. I mean, it's such a classical passage, and it speaks about, in some ways, kind of the summation of our culture. We're all about doing. In the Western culture, meditation is not really highly praised. People who are passive, who are meditating, who are contemplating but never do anything, they're regarded as losers, basically. That's our culture. Our culture is very active, and it's a Faustian culture. Action, that's what life is all about. It's about action. That's the way, at least, we portray it. So there is no balance, there's no anything, because it's all about action, action, action. Versus word, which of course in Greek, as Faust is reading it, he's reading the Greek New Testament, is logos. And logos is this idea of something that encompasses more than just a word, of course. It's a philosophy, it's kind of the epitome of rational thinking, but not just thinking, but kind of a philosophy in itself, right? In the beginning was the word. And of course, the irony of that is, in Latin, if you read John 1, the Latin for word is verbum, which we get our word for verb. Again, we're back to action right away. So, and of course, as God speaks, things are created. I was reading today something about, I was kind of reading up on alchemy because alchemy is a big part of all of this. And there was this rabbi who was instructing his student, and he said, when you copy a manuscript, the scriptures, don't omit a single letter or a single word, because the word, if you omit a word, you have just destroyed a world. And the reason he says that, of course, is because in the mystical, in Jewish mysticism, the words that God spoke when he created were kind of magical, right? That's what they were thinking. Even the alphabet is considered magical because it's a primeval, Hebrew alphabet, Aleph, Bet, is this kind of sacred letters and sacred words. They were considered sacred, and they became a big part of mysticism and Gnosticism and alchemy. And so this idea that word is powerless and kind of passive is, of course, not true. And so Faust wrestling with this is very interesting because it's this conflict of the West versus East in some ways. The meditative culture, the kind of the maybe in some ways more passive culture versus the Western culture, which is all about energy and action and kind of doing. And we're talking about Faustian age. I mean, it's perfect. It's a perfect description of Faustian age because it's all about incessant striving and action. And this passage is kind of passage par excellence, I guess, of that. Joe, go ahead. Sorry, I took up some time.
No, I mean, you kind of completely, that's a fascinating point, and one I had not considered, and I actually think we should come back to as well. Yeah, I mean, the thing that struck me the most again is the relationship between God and the devil. I mean, it doesn't seem to be almost adversarial at all. They almost seem like they're kind of friends when they're having their conversation. But I, like you, I picked up on the most important part of the exchange for me was this discussion around reason, specifically. That basically, Mephistopheles is basically saying that they would be better off without reasons, that it's made them beasts more than beasts could ever be, or something. I forget the exact line. I could look it up. But the idea, the reason why I thought it was so interesting is that, and I thought back to a conversation that Doug and Madeline and I had during last week's meetup. We had a discussion about science and some of the things like the Manhattan Project. And I thought about it, and I was like, our ability to reason hasn't always been the greatest thing in the world. And you tend to, you kind of look at it, this gift from God, right? That you're able to think and comprehend, and that it's this wonderful thing. But it is this thing that actually that has been used for evil, and it creates some existential crisis for us as well. So I think that's, it's an interesting thing. I mean, we have the ability to do things like create medicine solutions to problems and help people and, work with each other, but it's not always, doesn't always end up well. That's just one aspect of thinking about how reason is, there's two sides to it. But there's another aspect of it. The second point that I thought, that I really took away from this section was just how dissatisfied Faust was with his life, which is obvious, right? Here he is, he's about to commit suicide, and he's this, PhD, he's, read law, he knows philosophy, he knows theology, he knows all of these things. He's this brilliant man, he's this well-read person, and he's in this dark study, and he's about to kill himself. And so you start to wonder. And then the very next day, now it shouldn't be lost on us that it is Easter, that he's out in the streets, and the students and the villagers, they're all happy. and they're, you know, completely satisfied with their lives. So, you know, here's the most learned man, and celebrated to a certain degree, a man that he's walking around the streets completely depressed, and yet there's something to be said. And I think that's only interesting for one specific reason. I think we overlook the beauty of everyday life and ordinary life sometimes, and how that can be blissful. And sometimes, you know, you when you have this continued need for knowledge or more, there's this, you know, obviously this lack of satisfaction, but that seems to happen quite a bit if you approach knowledge wrong. I'll just say that, is that, if that makes sense, with a you know, poor attitude. The other part is that struck me as well, is this, his desire to be like God, you know, that this satisfaction has a way of actually really turning dark, to the point where, again, he turns to magic as a way of, you know, kind of trying to be more like God, to learn more. Because there was one line that I don't have it in front of me, is something something where he actually talks about, I believe, that he turned to magic essentially because he doesn't want to deal with words anymore at all. You know, that he's essentially done, you know, I forget the exact, behold the source whence all proceeds, and deal no more in words, words, words. And I lead that to the translation that you were talking about, with his willingness to translate, you know, in the beginning was the word, and the arrogance that takes, the lack of humility that he's going to, that the word is insufficient for him in some way, shape, or form, or it's insufficient, so that he's going to rewrite it, and make it his, you know, make it what he thinks it should be. I think he said something about like being appropriate to German language or something like that. But anyway, it to me, there's just such a arrogance and lack of humility within that he has no, I don't know, acceptance of a higher power, or, you know, unwilling to accept any type of higher power, and that he wants to know everything, and that he'll do it at any cost. And I find that to be interesting. There are a lot of other things I overlooked, I mean, with this particular, but it's a very, there are a lot of deep concepts here that are being, especially considering, and I know Doug and Madeline probably could go into and feel like you can go into the romantic movement and some of the other things that are impacting how this is written. But I'm really enjoying it. I could tell you that. I did read a few translations, and it's pretty interesting to see the variation in some of the translations as well. You know, did find, I forget which one to be the best, the one that you suggested. I think it's it doesn't matter, the Greenberg, is it, I forget, Greenberg, is it translation, to be the best? Yeah, I forget what, anyway, that was one of my favorite, that was my favorite.
Yeah, but
anyway,
the critical,
yeah.
Norton, I think it was called Norton.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, so those are just some initial comments. I have some more that I could probably share, but I'm gonna shut up.
No, that's great. That's great. Allison, I'm going to say just a few words. As Joe was talking, Joe, you reminded me of the point I wanted to make, and I forgot. So before I forget again, it's sometimes, you know, when you read these things, it's good to know what's there, but also what's not there. And one thing that struck me as I was rereading this passage is what Faust never really aims for is anything that has to do with morality. Morality is not on the table for him at all, which is a great contrast with Dante. I know a lot of you guys have been part of the Dante group, and if you remember Dante's problem, he was also in a spot that he was not. He realized he was not flourishing. He was not. He was conflicted. He was in trouble. But Dante's quest was for something completely different than Faust, which is interesting to compare how different those mindsets are: the medieval mindset, the limited mindset, and as Joe was talking about, this idea of infinity and striving for infinity. So Dante's quest was for some sort of inner peace with God or harmony with God's law or something along those lines. There are different ways you can express it, but that was the quest. Faust's quest has nothing to do with that at all. He is not immoral, he is amoral. There is no questions of morality at all. And of course, it becomes obvious why. You can't have both things. You cannot have infinity and morality in one at the same time. You got to pick one. It's like the Venn diagram that doesn't overlap, because as soon as you introduce some sort of morality, it limits you. You can't be infinite anymore. You cannot have infinite sort of projection into the universe if you're going to be constrained by something. Morality is like a ballast that constrains you, right? You can't have both, and that's the dilemma that we face today, very much so. How do we live in a world where, we make up morality as a sort of consensus, social consensus, not as a revelation from higher power, as it used to be. And because it's a consensus, it's kind of always shifting, right? And we have to deal with that. And it is a constraint, but it is a constraint that is very fluid. And Faust, by the way, has no conception of that whatsoever. And of course, it will express itself in how he walks over people. But at the same time, I want to say, when I read it initially, you can't help but admire him. The drive, right? The idea that you want to, you're not satisfied with anything less than everything. When I was a kid, growing up in Soviet Union, we had a magazine for kids, and its title was "I Want to Know Everything." And no limits. So it was very Faustian in that sense. It was kind of it was for kids, but still that same idea, no limits, right? And of course, Oedipus comes to mind, right? I want to know everything. Okay, you want to know everything? Here you go. And then the tragedy, right? So it's a classic theme that, of course, is addressed here in Faust as well. Allison, go ahead. Sorry, I keep jumping in here.
Oh, that's fine. Yeah, actually, I was really struck. My thoughts are kind of all over with this, but there were just a few lines that really stood out for me. And one of them was, it said, "A good man in his dark and secret longings is well aware which path to go." And that's something that I've thought about a lot, that I thought when someone is about to do something really awful, do they wrestle with it or not? And my theory is that the very people who do those things aren't the ones wrestling with it. They're the ones just doing it. And that the people who have to really, have this whole moral dilemma are the ones, they're just not going to do it. So it's, I don't know, it's just kind of an interesting thought. And then another thing that I really noticed was the whole scene with the students and the servant girls. And especially the line where it said, "The hand that wields the broom on Saturdays is best for Sunday's sweet caresses." And that reminded me a lot of Giselle, because, it's this common theme of the wealthier man going in off with the peasant girls, and then tragedy ensues. But it's a class issue. It's not so much about having a little romance, but what's interesting is that they bring in the class issue between the students and the servants. So that there's a whole lot of ideas going on about that. And I don't think that it's an accident that they mention the two different classes of people. I think and again, this is the first time I've ever read this, so I haven't finished this book, so I don't play. So And then like another one was when Faust says, I am too old for mere amusement and still too young to be without desire. And I thought, well, that's pretty much sums up what it means to be middle-aged. You know, you're not with these like 20-year-old youthful desires, you know, amusements, but you still have desires for things. And I just like that line a lot. But then the one thing that I really noticed was when Faust is having this conversation with how do you say it? Mephistopheles?
Mephistopheles.
Mephistopheles. Okay. And I just really love this image where he said, what poor devil can you offer? And I'm just going to kind of skip. He said, you offer food which does not satisfy. You offer sports where no one gains the prize. A girl perhaps who is in my very arms hangs on another with conspiring eyes. And I love that analogy because when you think of, I mean, this was written before fast food, but so maybe they were talking about, you know, you get to eat broth when you want a dinner. But, you know, in our world, I immediately think fast food when you want something that real, that is sustaining. And, you know, and then to compare that to a girl who's looking at another with conspiring eyes. So just this idea that like, is a relationship worth anything if you constantly have to look over your shoulder and like, well, what's she going to do next? Who's she going after next? You know? And
This
then
is the
comparing
classic New York dating scene.
Yes, but it really is like such a great analogy of these two things where you're getting something, but you're not actually getting something. You know, you like, I don't know, you want something that's going to sustain you, and that's not it. And then the last one that I just loved was when Mephistopheles says, you know, blood is a very special juice. That's just a great line. I mean, it's like vampire sort of imagery. And I'm finding I'm really enjoying this. And I just also sort of like this whole, you know, this theme of it, because I feel like there's so many Faustian bargains that we all make, you know, in our lives where we're like, you know, do you want the job that's going to pay you a lot, but you can't live with what you're doing? You know, do you want there's a million of these situations in life. And I'm really, you know, looking forward to reading more of this. And, you know.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Allison. Guys, just one quick question. Could you please type in question mark in the chat? It just makes it easier for me to track the order in which I can call on you. Okay, with that, we're gonna have Ella, Doug, and Madeline. And the rest of you could, if you want to contribute, please just type in exclamation mark in the chat. Thank you. Ella, go ahead.
Yeah, some great comments so far. Very interesting story. Carl Jung has written about Job as well. Actually, Edinger, who's a Jungian scholar, did a small book on, from a Jungian perspective, on Job's story. And what he notated was that from the Jungian perspective is that Job's story is an archetypal image which pictures a certain typical encounter between ego and self. Faust, of course, does the same. With the Job archetype, according to Edinger, there is first an encounter between the ego and the greater personality, also called by Jung the self, also referred to as the unconscious, in terms of being with a higher power, in this case, with Faust, God and angels. So you have this encounter between the ego in Faust and God and the angels, okay? And then secondly, a wound or suffering of the ego results as a result of that encounter. Third, the ego survives and perseveres the ordeal and continues to search for meaning. So that's important. The ego must survive this very daunting ordeal. And Fourth, and finally, a divine revelation by which the ego is rewarded by a deep insight into the transpersonal nature of the psyche. So that's the Jungian analysis of Job's encounter. And I was also just going to add, I think that gives us a lot of insight into this from a psychological perspective. Allison mentioned that he's wrestling with it. And this is very much a theme with Carl Jung, the wrestling of the ego and the deeper self or the unconscious, which wants to be known. And Joe mentioned the God and the devil seem more like friends. Well, Carl Jung would say that as well, the shadow being the dark side and, God being the higher, godlike, transcendent side of man. So it's just a lot to think about, but it's always good to think of it from Jung's perspective as well.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ella. That was very interesting. I find Jung kind of always in the background when I read about God, devil, some of these, sort of primeval forces like that. I do sometimes, though, I wonder, as you become more detailed or as he becomes more detailed in his analysis, if it doesn't lose some of its power, because when you start kind of really delving into details, I wonder if it's still kind of generally applicable to everybody. Like for Job and this idea of divine revelation, yes, that happened to him. How does it work for the rest of us? I mean, I guess it probably does in a lot of different ways, especially for people that have experienced some sort of traumatic ordeal, like maybe battling with a disease, life-threatening disease, especially coming out on the other side of it. A lot of people do have, or they talk about having some sort of almost like a revelation or an insight into life. I wonder though how this applies to Faust. Maybe we'll see it a little bit later, but it's very curious. Thank you for bringing that up. We have Doug and then Madeline.
To pick up on the theme of the wound to an ego, I think what's interesting, and I think it actually points to the fact that Faust does have a moral sense, but he finds it's obsolete or doesn't work. I mean, he has studied law, which is to sort of resolve conflict. He's studied medicine to heal people. He's studied philosophy and theology to find the truth from different angles. And he's found it all not useful. It hasn't worked. And one of the most telling episodes is when they go to the village and everybody praises him and his father for curing the town of an epidemic. And he later reveals to his sidekick, well, no, we actually realized we were killing people, but everybody was like giving us a lot of credit. And so that sort of gets reprised in Mephistopheles when he runs Faust's assistant through all these different disciplines and kind of says, yeah, you could do this. And he goes, yeah, that's great. And you could do this. And that's great. And you could do that. And that's great. But they're really shallow. They're not moves to the truth. They're moves to the manipulations of the knowledge for personal profit and ego. So the fact is, he knows he's supposed to be doing something good, but he finds all of his attempts are useless, which actually in a way gets to the Gita. When you get attached to the fruits of your actions, you get messed up. You stop doing the good, And I heard Joan Baez talk about this when I was in college, that, from Gandhi's approach, you're not going to solve the world's problems in few years. You're not going to solve it in your lifetime. It's the work of generations. You can't get attached, because if you get attached, you're going to fail, and then you're going to get disillusioned and give up. And, every pessimist is an idealist who's been disappointed, I think. You have to be a true pessimist, you have to at one point been a tremendous idealist, I think. And it creates a kind of flip, which Peer Gynt and Ibsen gets into that, but I'll save that maybe for later.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. I think of Faust as a sort of this a breed of existentialist who just wants to experience things, and whatever it costs other people, that's sort of a secondary concern.
Well, that is true. The other thing I was going to say is that he says, I don't want pleasure. I want pain. I want the wrestling match. I want the conflict. I want to get to the heart of it. And so that's a weird aspiration in terms of the damage it does to him and others, but, or possible damage.
Yeah. Madeline and then Ginny.
Wow, these have been great comments so far. I thought I would bring up, excuse me, two topics. One is the humor in this. I had no idea the whole thing was so funny. I had, mentions of it I read everywhere. It made it seem like this sort of long, dreary morality tale. But even just with, like within Night, he says, people say how often I have heard it. Actors could really give lessons to the clergy. And I think that Goethe is really kind of anti-religion in this, because when he talks about Faust's reflections on his setting aside suicide when he hears the Easter bells, what has happened is, he says, it was the memory of a feeling from childhood. In other words, it wasn't a current feeling, it was just the memory of a feeling that came over me. I thought there were, and then his description in the same part of Night, his description of scholars' activities, paste bits and pieces together, cook up a beggar's stew from others' leftovers. Then he also had many mentions of science, and looking back on how things were done. For example, in the part with the angels, the first angel is talking about everything moving in perfect spheres, but the next one mentions the earth spinning. In other words, it's rotating, which was, I believe, Galileo who insisted on that point. We have seeing people from far off as through a spyglass, which is how Wagner describes Faust's sort of telescope view of people, that he's too far out. So I think that Faust is really the eternal quester. He has been searching for something his whole life, and he's not finding it through reading. He's not finding it through studying the ancients. He clearly has not found it in religion. What he seems to be looking for is really just this total immersion experience. Because when he talks about magic, he talks about basically becoming immersed in the flows of the world. And we can see when he goes out on Easter Sunday, we see all those stock characters who would have been completely familiar to the people of the time. All of them were immersed in their lives. And yet in Faust Study Part 2, really when Mephistopheles dresses up as Faust and impersonates him, he is basically advising against it. Well, first of all, as Faust leaves and he's putting on the gown, he sort of says to himself, I guess, despise learning, heap contempt on reason, the human race's best possession. So I don't know if that's a Goethe's judgment or if that's the judgment of the shadow side. But clearly the devil is at work in advising the student on what career to go into, what faculty he should choose. He basically says, he compares thinking, so he says basically a loom is a computer. Our thinking instrument behaves like a loom. Every thread at a step on the treadle set in motion, etc. He gets into rote logic. He's clearly mocking Aristotle. they're struck all of a heap, his admiring hearers, but still it doesn't make them weavers. So in other words, just learning the ancient ways of logic and thought, the peripatetics of Aristotle, is not going to turn you into any kind of true thinker. So now he moves on to metaphysics. He dispels that. Good sense is treated as nonsensical, benefactions as a botheration. That's his dismissal of a career in law, which is, he doesn't take too long with that one. Then he deprecates theology. Medicine's an easy art to master. Up and down, you study the whole world, only so as to discover in the end it's all up to the Lord. Whereas in fact, in medieval times, there were several places where atheism was fairly common. One was the barroom, the saloon. The other was the gambling den, and the other was the physician's consulting room, because doctors were doing what they could, and otherwise it was just sort of all up to the Lord. And so they had to have some sort of belief in their own powers. But the dark side is dismissing this here. I thought his summary of medicine above all, learn your way with women if you mean to practice medicine. The aches and pains that torture them from one place only, one, all stem. Cure there, cure all. Act halfway decent, and you'll find the whole sex acquiescent. So basically, he recommends medicine. He goes on basically to recommend medicine as a career simply because it would allow the student access to more women, whether it's sexual or just admiration. Then when the student wants his autograph, in other words, a signature in his autograph book, which was a common thing of the time, he inscribes from Genesis, you shall be as gods, know good and evil. So clearly that is his MO, is to be equated with the serpent, both to advise to get knowledge, but also to say it's all worthless. And then they're going to be sweeping up. I'll heat some gas, that way we'll rise up quickly off the face of the earth. If we're light enough, we'll lift right up. And there again, we have discoveries that were in the general era of Goethe, which was buoyant gases. I mean, the Chinese knew about them a long time ago, about heating air and lanterns. But so anyway, I thought the science, and I loved the humor. I just thought it was very dark and very funny, and still applies now. Much of it does.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, that's another, I keep coming back to this Faustian man paradigm. And one of the paradigms in a Faustian age is you cannot have things that are sacred. That's a limitation. You cannot have things that are off limits for joking. That's a limitation. And again, whether you disagree or agree with it, that's just the facet of this kind of model of thinking that if nothing is off limits. You can joke about being a doctor and using that to take advantage of women, and or mocking kind of the religious sentiment by writing, the devil writing the famous verse from Genesis where about the fall of man. I absolutely agree. It's this comedian streak that is very, very much in line with our culture today. And I think Goethe was probably ahead of his time in a way, putting this right in kind of front and center of everything, because this idea of divide of sacred and profane, which was fundamental in the medieval mindset, it's completely thrown out. I mean, it probably started even like way before Goethe with like, who am I thinking of? Pantagruel and Voltaire and some of these guys who were mocking religion, you know, especially Voltaire and Candide, right? Mocking religion and mocking this idea of God is going to like oversee everything, and everything's going to work out for the best, and we'll live in the best of all possible worlds. And absolutely, like this is totally the world we're in today, where everything is allowed, everything is a subject for kind of ridicule if we wanted to. Ginny, go ahead, and then Doug.
So did Goethe create this Faust and Mephistopheles characters, or was somebody else who created it first?
Well,
And Goethe did his own rendition of those characters.
They're supposed to be historical. I mean, not Mephistopheles, of course, but Faust is supposed to be a historical figure. We just don't know that much about him. He lived in the late 1400s. And then the first description of his life is published in 1585, I believe, or 1587, the so-called Faust Book, which was basically just like almost like a comic book, essentially. It was just very short and kind of the stories outlined there. And then we have, of course, Marlowe's Faust.
Right. I remember I did the production of Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus in college.
Yep.
So I was wondering who came first. It was Goethe first and then Marlowe, of course, right?
No, the other way around, because Goethe.
Oh, it was the other way around. Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
Goethe is writing this in, well, he started in 1770, finished this in like 1830 something, just on his deathbed, basically. In fact, the full version of the work was not published until after he died. So he finished it on his deathbed. He was writing it for like 60 years, on and off. But yeah, he comes much later after Marlowe.
Right, Marlowe was contemporary to Shakespeare, right? Correct, right?
Correct.
Yes.
Right. Okay.
And so
Okay, thank you for that.
Faust himself was a historical figure from Germany, lived in, and I'm trying to remember which I had in my mind, the university that he went to. I think it was either Leipzig or some other university in the center of Germany. But he became very quickly an infamous figure who supposedly made a pact with the devil. And from there, you have all the stories circulating, which were then put together in the Faust book. And then Marlowe took that, ran with it, created the first kind of collection of an actual, like a play about that. If you read Marlowe and you compare it to Goethe's Faust, you will see that Marlowe is not as deep. I mean, it's more about moral issues of going to hell, and of course the ending is completely different. But Goethe takes that idea nearly 200 years later and completely transforms it and makes it into an epic, and an epic of these questions that have plagued us for I would say the last 200 years, essentially, maybe more, of this relationship of what is man's role in the world, what is path to satisfaction, and so forth.
And also, you don't have Mephistopheles and Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faust, right?
You have the devil.
But it was not Mephistopheles. Okay.
The name Mephistopheles, I don't think is there. So Mephistopheles is I believe Goethe's invention, which is why we don't know the exact etymology of that.
Aren't writers amazing? They're just amazing.
Oh, absolutely.
They're the ones who are like gods. They create all this,
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Yep. Oh, Doug and then Dmitry. Doug,
yeah, it was a German folk tale, and then Marlowe picked that up, and then it went back to Germany. And yeah, I guess it is sort of based on a figure. Marlowe's is very amazing, but it's and some of the final imagery has this cosmic sense of, I think, the blood of Christ streaming through the stars. I mean, poetically, it's quite incredible, but theatrically, it's very much dependent on spectacle. I actually saw a Christian theater production of it, which I referred to briefly before, but they really went for almost the Star Wars spectacle. And we all realized in San Diego that the play is really built on those visual spectacles, whereas Shakespeare's more built on the words that reveal actions and sub-actions and hidden actions as something much stranger. But Marlowe was definitely very theatrical in his effects. So that's interesting. I don't have anything. I think that's something I left. Oh, the art is long, life is short. I think for anybody who works in the arts or in medicine, just at the point you feel you're useful, your eyes go and you can't do surgery anymore, or you finally figured out to play Hamlet, but you're too old for anybody to cast you. Although one of the best Hamlets I saw was Nicol Williamson, and he was 40 when he played Hamlet, and he played it so fast. I mean, so light on his feet, so funny, that was an example of somebody who had the years to figure out the role, who got a chance to play it. But he was surrounded by what I thought was a fairly traditional, mediocre production. So it's like, you practice a craft, whether it's medicine or theater or philosophy, and finally you begin to get it together, and then the mind starts to give way. You finally figured out the technique, but it's divorced it from the passion that led you to want to really do it in the first place. So, and I think different philosophers, from Whitehead to other people, deal with this. And Chaucer picked up that phrase. I think Horace maybe picks it up. I think Dante may refer to it at some point. And it's from medicine. It's from Hippocrates. By the time he figured out how to heal people, he's on the verge of death. It's like the great tragedy of life. It's like what Beckett said, we're born astride the grave. It's like, and there's a flash of light, and then it's over.
Awesome. Yeah, that's true. Very true. Dmitry, then we have Madeline and Joe.
Yes, regarding the bet between Mephistopheles and Faust. So there is something paradoxical in what Faust is saying. On the one hand, he wants to be released from his striving. He wants to enjoy the fair moment, just simply enjoy life. On the other hand, he realizes that once he does that, once he simply enjoys life and is freed from his striving, he perishes. So there is something fundamental about striving. It's central to our existence. Striving has to be in order for us to live, somehow, not just to enjoy life, but it's fundamental. He says the primacy of striving. You see the paradox. There's some paradoxical about it,
Yeah,
On the one hand,
for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, if you go back to the exchange between God and Mephistopheles, God says, as long as man strives, he will err. He will miss the mark, but that's part of the deal. And the idea there is, if the devil is able to corrupt him, like Dmitry, you just said, that means no more striving, because you're corrupted and you found your niche, you're ready to give up your soul for whatever it is you found, done. So in that sense, I guess that's the connection between the bet that Faust makes with the devil and the bet that the devil makes with God. It's not so clear, but when you think about it, I guess it does kind of pertain to the same thing, meaning if Faust is corruptible, that will mean that he will stop striving. The way Faust expresses it, if there is any one thing that I'm willing to say, stop moment, in other words, stop time, stop change, stop everything, then you can take my soul.
Yes.
Because and that's actually, I guess, translates pretty closely to the bet that he made with God, because God said, well, as long as he's striving, he's going to keep making mistakes, but that's okay, because eventually he'll figure it out. And God presents himself as this gardener who is watching this plant. And this is very interesting because if you remember, Goethe wrote this treatise on metamorphosis of plants. And the idea there was that plant is actually a leaf. Every part of plant is a leaf that is just in a different sort of configuration. So every part of the plant is ultimately a leaf. And there's probably some truth to that. Basically, the idea is that whatever is present in the leaf is present in other parts of the plant. But this idea that God is essentially guiding this plant to grow a certain way, and there could be some twists and turns, but along the way, but eventually we get to the right configuration. So that's Dmitry, thanks for pointing that out. I guess we've kind of figured out together whether the bet between God and the devil and the bed between Faust and the devil are actually the same bed. It wasn't clear to me initially whether they were actually the same.
No, they're very similar.
Yeah, I guess so. Let's see. Let me just go back to who we had here. Madeline and Joe.
All right, well, I'm off on a slightly different track.
Okay.
Since we have Doug here, I was struck by the strong role of descriptions in the play. Basically, in every scene, someone is describing where they are. And it almost makes it seem as if, the whole thing were meant to be read to yourself or just read aloud. Starting with the prelude, the manager says, the posts are up, the floorboards laid. So he's saying, this is where we're at with we've got the posts up, we have the floorboards, we've set up the bare bones of the theater. So he's describing where they are. The next description of where they are is in, let's see. We're gonna bookmarks. I have 3 nail files and a pencil as my bookmarks here. When we have Faust going out outside the town gate, there's just one description after another by the characters, and describing their actions. Like the old peasant says, so please accept our best cup, sir, brimful with the freshest beer. They talk about the sunshine. They sort of just describe everything. Then we have, still in outside the town gate, is Faust kind of going off into a world of fancy. He's talking about the sun is starting to set. Look how the sunset's level beams gild those cottages in their green bower. And then he goes off into his desire to eternally pursue something. He's talking about the sun. If only I had wings to rise into the air and follow ever after. And then he goes into a very beautiful description, basically taking us aloft with him as he circles the globe. Then we have Mephisto doing exactly the same thing as Faust has done in his fancies and others have done, which is that he is sort of going on about all the wonderful things that are going to happen. This is in Faust Study 1, approximately line 1480, it starts. And dark cloud banks scatter so that all is fair for him. Starlets are glittering, milder suns glowing, angelic troops shining in celestial beauty. Makes it sound like he's going to be an Instagram or TikTok influencer, doesn't it? Vines clambering and twisting. And he goes on and on. Lakes at the foot of green hills, birds blissfully drink there. He's weaving a world of illusion for Faust that's comparable to the world of illusion of the theater and the play. And in fact, the only real device that I noted here that would be very handy dandy for staging this was that he puts the dog on a cushion behind the stove. The poodle in this case would not have been a little manicured thing. It would have been a big shaggy hunting dog, basically. A big black shaggy hunting dog in the European tradition of the black dog that appears out of nowhere represents the devil, which apparently was a fairly old folk theme dating back to the medieval era. And so having the dog behind the stove and then some billows of smoke, and then Mephistopheles appears, that was the only thing I really saw as a bit of this could be performed on stage and here's how we'll do it. I was wondering what Doug thinks of all this.
That's a long discussion, but in fact, I don't think Faust imagined the play could be produced just as Ibsen didn't really imagine Peer Gynt would be produced. And of course they were produced because, but there's something very important. Some people produce these with they build a mountainside and they have avalanches and they do this. But Shakespeare actually was writing where you saw the visuals, you saw the light, you heard the sound effects basically from within the poetry. And it's a theater of the mind to a great degree. And I think Faust does do that as well. Many people were very influenced by Shakespeare. The Germans were lucky in that they had two great translators who translated Shakespeare, and they had a big influence on German playwrights because it was apparently an incredibly skilled translation of Shakespeare. So it's an interesting thing, but the empty space, like Peter Brook, who died recently, a great British director, wrote a book called The Empty Space. And the theater shouldn't be these big museums. They should be empty spaces where actors can go in and create realities through words and movement. And because this all goes back to the medieval and the Greeks, where you performed outdoors under a bright sun, and you had to create a cloudy storm. You had to create the visual imagination was within the poetry, and it requires a certain kind of deliverance from the actors. Stanislavski, the great Russian acting teacher, writes about this, where the great actor's vocal technique is based on getting the audience to see what the character is seeing. You know, it's like you're instilling a spell in the audience with the words, where they're actually seeing it almost more vividly than they imagine. Sometimes people will go see a play or a movie and they will imagine that there was a knife floating in the air, or there was, and then they go back and they look at it and they go, no, that triggered the imagination, but it didn't really exist in the original film, or it didn't really happen there. So there was a great theorist, Granville Barker, in England and America, who returned Shakespeare from the set designers to the actors to set the stage. And the early 20th century. And they were, because if you build sets for everything Shakespeare describes, you slow down the action of the play. And it's not always big battles and war scenes. The actions can be very subtle. For the Greeks, an apple turning green to red, that was a form of action. That's a form of change. Whatever changes anything is an action. So it's not always swashbuckling actions, and the subtlety of actions in Shakespeare are astonishing. And if an actor, he changes tones within not only a sentence, but within a phrase of a sentence. So that's why it's so hard to translate Goethe, is we don't have the brilliant translators the Germans had for Shakespeare. It's really hard to get the shifts of tone, as the turning on a dime that Shakespeare gets in English, and that apparently they achieved in German translations of Shakespeare. But that ability to turn on a dime, where Faust is deadly serious and then cracks a joke, and then and I put a note to Mephistopheles and Faust is the same name, a little different spelling in Marlowe, I think, but it's but he's also, it's interesting how they costume these people. Faustus's devil comes disguised as a likable father confessor, you know, so he's a priest kind of. So he comes in the guise of a religious figure who will be trusted by Faust. And even though Faust knows he's the devil, it's like he's disguised in something that won't scare him too much. You know? So that's another sort of sample of the appearances of the stage and the reality of the stage, and the magic tricks that the stage can do. And Goethe's really, so it is, I think it was produced soon after he died, but I don't think he imagined it was. And a lot of these people were, I wanted to say this, the stage of the actual stage, at this period of time with playwriting, Shakespeare said it, all the world's a stage. Well, the Germans sort of said there is a world stage and we are writing about it. These plays can't necessarily actually be staged, even though they were very soon staged because of the crazy. There are some experimental writers now who say, they encourage their students to write impossible things and let their designers figure out how to do it. So a famous New York writer, Mac Wellman, has a scene where a character opens a suitcase and he pulls out the moon, and the moon floats into the sky. And you go, well, how is that going to be done? He says, I don't know. That's not my problem. The designers have to figure out how to do that, or the actors have to figure out how to do that. So that's where theater turns to poetry, both in its physicality and in its words. I don't know if that answers it, Madeline, but it's like,
Thank you.
all the world's a stage.
I also think that there had to be some intention, at least, by Goethe to have it played and performed in a theater, because of the whole dialogue. Well, not the dialogue, but the discussion between the director, the poet, and the comedian sort of presupposes that they are staging something. And
I agree. Yeah.
They're discussing the best strategy on how to perform it, right? And so they're saying, okay, put a little action into it, put a little this, a little bit of that. And then they're also discussing the crowds, which are breaking their necks to get into a performance. So I think it was already kind of, I think probably Goethe assumed it was going to be played. And of course,
he staged a lot of plays. I think he pretty much ran a theater and was a director.
I think that despite the self-descriptions, I don't think they take away from the theatrical aspect of it at all. And in fact, as Doug mentioned, Shakespeare had been translated into German and had exerted an enormous influence on Goethe. And we see that because of these monologues by Faust, which are very, very Shakespearean. And in fact, people compare the monologue in the opening to Hamlet's monologue in Hamlet. So these monologues, the idea of the director and the comedian, and also some of the instructions on sprinkled throughout the book, where to enter the three archangels and do this, and kind of, so you can kind of tell that it's following the playwright's script in a sense. All right, I want to make sure everybody gets a chance to speak. So we have Joe, Jan, and Ella, and Andrea after that.
Actually, you can skip me. I was just going to go over something that, like, very briefly about the
Okay, I'll skip.
so yeah, if there's that many people in the queue,
Yeah, no problem. We'll get back.
We'll come back to me if it's still time. If there's still time.
Thank you, Joe. Jan, and then Ella and Andrea. Jan, go ahead. Can't hear you. Go to the next person. Okay, Ella, and then Andrea.
Yeah, I found an interesting aside here. According to family legends, Carl Jung's grandfather was possibly or probably Goethe's illegal son. And so both being from Germany and the same culture, and it's certainly a possibility, but I just found that interesting. The other thing I wanted to mention is alchemy, which is an ancient version of chemistry, which you probably know, but or medieval, not ancient, but medieval. And so I had a hard time just wrapping my mind around alchemy, but I think it may be essential to sort of keep it in mind to some extent while reading the story. Just to know a little bit about it, that you can take a base element and transform it into gold. And as it, I know, but as it applies to the spirit or the psychological realm of Jung, that would mean that during this process of upheaval, psychological upheaval that he's going through, that this process of alchemy may be mentioned in one way or another. And I think already they've mentioned a couple of elements like blood, and was there a mention of fire? I think so. But it's just interesting to keep in mind, was that a construct of the writer? Because that was a big a way of thinking at that time.
Ella, you basically you took the words out of my mouth, because I wanted to, after we give a chance for everybody to speak, I wanted to come back to this notion of alchemy in the larger context of not just alchemy per se, but in this context of Gnosticism, Hermeticism, and mysticism in medieval mindset. So thank you for bringing this up. You're absolutely correct that alchemy is in fact a major part of the design, and people, I think the argument right now is not whether or not it is, but which part it plays in the design of the work. But that it is certainly a part of the construction is probably not a controversial statement at all at this point. I mean, there's so many clues and so many tidbits here and there, and we've already seen a bunch of them, and I'll mention a couple of them in a second. But yeah, definitely, it plays a huge part, maybe even a fundamental part. And so I'll after everybody speaks, I'll try to. Hopefully, we'll have time to go back to that point. So thank you for bringing that up. So we have Andrea, and then Jan and Joe. Jan, if you have your sound, we'll go back to you.
Testing, testing.
All right.
Can you hear me?
Yep. Okay. So right after Andrea. Okay.
Can I go ahead?
Yeah,
I
go
just
ahead.
want
Go ahead,
to
Andrea.
first of all say that's been a very insightful conversation, and I'd like to add what Doe was talking about. So when you're talking about in the beginning was the word, and then he goes on the mind, and then he goes on the power and action. So when you're talking about that, it brought to my mind the idea of performance. So action here in the idea of performance, and the performance in the sense of what in line with Goffman, that was a sociolinguistic sociologist, talking about we perform in the everyday. So I was looking at how Faust was perhaps tired of performing as a scholar, or as an intellectual, or as a man of science, right? And then looking for different, or when he has the Pact, perhaps looking for a different way to perform in this world. So wearing different, being like an actor, right? And performing for the world. So it was just something that came to my mind as though was talking about action, and I thought of performance in this sense, which I think there's also relation, as this is a play, right? So this idea of performing in general. That's it. Thank you.
Interesting. Do you have could you put maybe a link to Hoffman in the chat? That'd be great for us to maybe take a look at it later. Okay, Jan, you're up.
Hey guys. So I was listening to all the comments, and what occurred to me is a question of why is it that we are so interested in this work? What is it that makes it so interesting to us? Is it the art? Is it the philosophy? It just occurred to me that it's the question itself that is being brought up here, which is why are we so every one of us feel that very clearly and very sort of dearly to our heart, and why is it such a pressure cooker? What is the deal there? And I think it is rooted very, very heavily in Western tradition. That the question here, and it came up in, I tried making some notes, but it came up in almost every comment that people made. Joe, you mentioned that the people on the street are happy. And then someone mentioned that, this idea of going into the world and coming to the gate, and that's where you find the happiness, but he doesn't quite go there. And the argument that I think Madeline who was mentioning that there was an advice to not go and get immersed into life. And then Ella mentioned about Jungian philosophy, and this is what struck the chord, that the ego and the self are in the battle, and the ego survives. But does it have to? The whole point of meditation is to destroy the ego. It does not survive. And this is the idea of the individualism and the reason versus collectivism in the Western tradition. And I think we all, after a certain age, start realizing that we cannot reason ourselves out of this existence, that there's got to be something else. And what the Western tradition tries to do, I think, is to solve this with morality. And that's what Phil started with, that if you just have the reason, you have this and you have that, and you can do this and you can do that, and it's all going to infinity because there's no weight assigned to any of these notions, of these notions that we're dreaming up, because it's all individual. The Western individualism and the reason are put on the pedestal, and that is what you get. If this is all we have, then we cannot solve the problem. And when we say word versus action, we're still saying staying inside of this framework, and all of us are being very good students of that, and nobody goes outside. We're trying to find a solution with it, this reason. We're trying to reason ourselves out of it. What is good? What is bad? And the solution must be come from some paragraph, from some explanation. And it may not be solvable, but I think all of us are, well, I don't know, maybe not all of us, but I think that is what the problem is. This is why it's such a pressure cooker. That's all I wanted to comment.
Thank you. Yeah, I totally agree. It's these perennial questions of how do we create I guess a flourishing world for everybody, right? And
so one more comment is that the devil is extremely clever in this setup. Why it's such a influential work, I think, is the devil did not pick a person from a street. He picked somebody who's immersed, the reason, a learned man with reasoning coming out of his ears, is one step away from reasoning himself and selling the soul, his soul, to the devil. So it's very unclear that the God will win here.
Right, we don't know, right?
Because
you don't know.
because right, I mean, because setting it up, that person is one step away from jumping into the abyss, because there is no reference, and the only references that he's looking at is to reason it out. So what he's looking at something, and that's why you turn to mystical, because it does not, you cannot find it in books, you cannot find it in theorems, you cannot find it in what you see. So there's got to be something else, and it's got to be the mysticism, but because that's the only thing we know here in the West. So I'm kind of done here.
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, this is the kind of the point of this, right? Of the book. It's not just about, I mean, we appreciate it for art, we appreciate it for a lot of things, but ultimately it's the questions that are raised that make us come back to it. And we talked about, we are living in the Faustian age. We are part of the paradigm where we're given a certain set of open-ended, I don't want to say answers, but let's say proposals, right, that are in front of us. And a paradigm that, by the way, is very different than the past paradigms. I mean, if we go back to Aristotle, the philosopher's idea was, well, we're just gonna rationally come up with a recipe for your life, and that's it. And the
But
rest
you don't have to go there. If Dante does not have these walls.
Who, Dante?
Dante.
Oh, absolutely, he has. He has all kinds of walls.
Right, but he's trying. It's more of a personal journey where the reasoning steps back.
No,
yes.
Not really. No, not at all. Not at all. Actually,
so?
No. In fact, the whole idea of Dante is that you bring in reason and sort of Christianity, religion together in this beautiful, beautiful sort of synopsis, and everything is going to work out great. That's Dante.
Well, he's using the reason, but he's using it very freely.
Yeah, but still, reason is a fundamental part of human being. Now, what the difference with Faust is, Faust saying, no. I've already tried all of these things. I've tried the rationality. I've tried religion. I've tried all these things. And to me, they're not the answer. So he knows Aristotle. He knows golden mean. He knows all these sort of prescriptions. And he says, you know what? That's all great. Doesn't work for me.
Right. This is the difference, right? So there's a list of things that you've gone through without sort of feeling it, whereas Dante is going through them one by one, and every time, every reason is there for a reason.
Right.
As opposed to, let me just learn this and this and this and this and this, and then I have a list, and now that I've learned everything, let me figure it out. So the point is to start acquiring the knowledge, and then that's somehow supposed to solve it. But with Dante, it's just a tool, right? I'm just going to use it. That's the only thing I know. So I'm going to use it and bring it. But what's driving it is kind of like the heart as opposed to the mind.
Okay. Well, we're not going to spend the time right now, but in general, though, this is the Faustian paradigm, I would say, is in some ways a going outside of whatever limits are set by reason, morality, or anything else. I mean, that's the age that we're in today. Okay, so we have Madeline and Ella. Can I ask you guys to wait just for like 5 minutes? I want to go back to this question of alchemy for just a second to set this up, because it's such an important part of the book, and I wanted to make sure we don't pass it over. So what is kind of the context of all this, and how does this relate to Gnosticism and alchemy and all these things? All right, so probably you already know this, but I'll just remind you that Gnosticism in general is this belief that a soul is, as we're born into this world, we're corrupted because our soul is an immaterial thing. And as we're born into this material world, the soul passes through certain regions which are governed by planets, AKA spirits, and we are tarnished as we kind of move from heaven, where our soul originally comes from, down to earth. Alchemy is a process that is physical, both physical and spiritual, of returning our soul into this original primeval state of bliss, of harmony, of oneness with the divine. Okay, the physical implications of it, which was turning metals into gold or whatever, is really not as crucial as the spiritual significance of all that. And the idea of the philosopher's stone, lapis philosophorum in Latin, is the idea of attaining a state which is essentially purified from all the different influences of these planets. So as you meld and combine and purify different metals, each of which represents a planet, by the way, right? Gold being the representation of the sun, and quicksilver being the representation of Mercury, and etc., and lead being the representation of Saturn. As you meld all these metals, you're doing something physical, but more importantly, you're doing something spiritual with your soul. And your soul is getting purified to this perfect state of oneness until you finally are supposed to get to this perfect concoction of the philosopher's stone. So this was Gnosticism, alchemy. It was really born out of all kinds of mystical beliefs during the Hellenistic times, then were combined with Christianity and the idea of the Platonic spheres, music of the spheres, and Pythagoras. I mean, it's just like this whole syncretism of all these different beliefs that became this enormous influence on the Western thinking, which again, most people would say that our current modern science owes its existence to alchemy and Gnosticism and all of these things, because they led to all kinds of experiments which were physical in nature, and that in turn bore its scientific results. And of course, Copernicus and Newton and pretty much all of our famous scientists, they were all alchemists. They were all after not just the transmutation of metals into gold, but they were after this spiritual quest. So Goethe takes that and makes all kinds of references in Faust to alchemy. We'll learn that Faust's father was an alchemist. He uses the terminology of the red lion and what was that other thing, that the lily and the queen, which is basically the red line is the gold, the lily is the silver, and then you combine the two and you get this electrum compound amalgamation of the two, right? Which is the queen. And basically it's like these are references to this alchemist quest to purification. Now the question that is open is this: perhaps the design of Faust as a work in itself. Oh, and by the way, the name for the quest of purification was called opus magnum, which we kind of use today as a word for masterpiece or epitome of something. Is perhaps the Faustian quest for meaning and the devil leading him through various experiences in itself an opus magnum? Is it perhaps a way for the devil to take Faust, who is in this putrefying state, in the state of decay, right? And leading him through different purifying experiences, an experience with Gretchen, an experience with Helen, an experience with all these other things that are coming yet. And in fact, leading him to this perfect moment where he says, "Stop, moment, you're so fair," which is the moment of essentially being this lapis philosophorum, right? The perfect unison, the perfect oneness with nature, with God, with self. Is this the design? And that's an open question, but it seems to me that Goethe was definitely thinking along those lines, because we have all of these references to alchemy. And in fact, Mephistopheles himself is somewhat like a mercurial character, right? And when I say mercurial, he is Hermes, right? In the tradition of alchemy, Hermes Trismegistus was the leader of the soul through this quest. He was this supernatural being that was leading a person to reach this perfection through all the different spheres. And now, we're just starting out on the journey, but it's clear that Mephistopheles is going to be the guide, the psychopomp in Greek, the leader of the soul through these different spheres. And it's interesting to compare the leader of Dante, who was Virgil, a classical poet, versus the leader of Faust, which is the devil. I mean, we've gone a long way from being led by a classicist a classical poet, to being led by supposedly the arch enemy of humankind. So this is my little detour into alchemy and Gnosticism and the connection between those beliefs and Faust as it touches on the design of the book. Okay, I am done. We're back to Madeline and then Ella. Madeline, go ahead.
Thanks, Phil. I loved the discussion of the juxtapositions, and Faust's guide is the devil, whereas Dante's is Virgil. So that's quite a gap. I wanted to, okay, so I think that on Jung's spectrum of psychological types, I would say that Dante is definitely over on the feeling end, whereas Goethe is way over on the thinking end in terms of how they process the world and think about life. All right, well, I said think, so you can see where I fall on it all. I wanted to pick up on something that Jan had said when I watched the video of the first session, which was that poem. I've read it, and I believe that's the poem in which the first person narrator says, "I have wasted my life," in response to the scenery and the world around him. And it reminded me of that beautiful poem by Rilke called Archaic Torso of Apollo. And Rilke talks about the light radiating from the marble and just basically how gorgeous the whole thing is. And he concludes with, there is nothing at all that is not looking at you. You must change your life. So I'll just say that again. There is nothing at all that is not looking at you. You must change your life. And it's that sense of total immersion that Faust is looking for. Even though Rilke came along much later, he was also a romantic and a Kantian, Joe. So going back to the question of the role of reason in this book and what the views are on it, I'm still kind of stuck on the part where in Faust Study Part 2, line 1881, where Faust has gone out and Mephisto is wearing Faust's gown, and he says, "Despise learning, heap contempt on reason, the human race's best possession." So clearly, he is saying reason is the human race's best possession. He thinks that Faust is a fool to want to go with him, to abandon classical learning and reason and logic and those ways of assessing life in order to go for magic and experience. On the other hand, it is the devil saying this. So can we take this as, should we take this as kind of the dark side, a dark view that is kind of wrong, would be wrong in God's eyes? Or should we be taking this as the creative God of the play, Goethe's point of view, which is that it is indeed the human race's best possession?
That's an open question.
Okay.
I think
As long as it made sense.
no, and a lot of times it's not clear, whether you should take Mephistopheles at his words, because as much as he himself says, "Well, I'm such a congenial guy," he then, in that same breath, he says he wants to annihilate everything. And his desire, he's so sick and tired of the human race, he just wants to obliterate the whole thing. So you kind of have to kind of wonder if you can actually trust what he says. And so, yeah, take his pronouncements as coming from the devil. Thank you, Madeline, for that. Ella.
Yes, thank you for going over the alchemism. I really, I think that's going to come up quite a bit. And we can anticipate that and look for that. I just wanted to comment on another comment, and I'm sorry I missed the person's name that made the comment, because I thought it was great the way it was said and the content of it. I do think there is a difference in the goal being to become ego-less, and the other goal, which is to encounter the ego, go through all these, psychological, almost, I would say, devastating depths of the self, and into the self, beyond the ego, lose your ego, but keep some of it, because you have to weather it, in my opinion, in order to get through life. I mean, on a scale of 1 to 10, we all have some ego. Some may have, way too much. They may be a 9 or a 10, and some may be at a 3. But I think we all are probably somewhere on that scale. And, in the West, of course, and I would think in the East as well, you have to get up and you have to provide for yourself and your loved ones. You have to take care of business to some extent. I guess a few people can meditate their entire lives. I haven't been able to do that personally, but I think it would be great. And I do try to get in touch with that. But I'm wondering if step 4, where it says, remember the steps, the encounter between the God, the higher power, whatever, the angels, a wound, a deep suffering of the ego. Man, you're gonna, it may go out the window. Everything you thought you learned, every degree you've earned, what you thought of your family, your God, whatever, it's all being put into question. And then somehow the ego survives this. And somebody made a comment, it may not, and it may not. It's a very deep journey. This is not superficial stuff. And then the fourth point and final point is the divine revelation. This is from on high, from deep, from your unconscious, from the collective unconscious, that Jung would say, which may be similar to maybe it's a language thing, to the the Buddhist state of egolessness, a divine revelation by which the ego is rewarded by a deep insight into the transpersonal psyche. Now, this is in Jung's psychological jargon, of course. It's psychological. It's not Eastern philosophy, but transpersonal means beyond self. Okay, so is it one and the same? But I will say, I think it is. But I will say, I don't know, and I do get annoyed sometimes when people want to go off on this hero's journey thing that you do hear a lot in the West. And it can be annoying when the circumstances are much deeper than just pulling yourself up by the bootstraps and getting on with it, because that's not what this is about at all. So that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you, Ella. I do want to just brief comment. I keep forgetting certain things as I cover these topics. Maybe I should prepare more. If you remember, the first thing that Faust turns to after his disillusionment with his sort of prescribed studies is the sign of the macrocosm. What is macrocosm? Well, macrocosm is this idea, something that sums up the universe. That's the sign of the macrocosm. Typically, it was the sphere that encapsulated everything from the Earth in the middle, in the geocentric worldview, to the empyrean, right? The realm of the divine. That's the macrocosm. Then he, after contemplating, he's still disillusioned, doesn't really solve anything. He turns to the sign of the spirit of this earth, the Geist der Verde, or Erde, the earth, right? Erde. The sign of the spirit of the earth is really the epitome of the microcosm, right? The thing that's below. So we have the macrocosm, the microcosm, and of course the great Gnostic document, the tabula, not tabula, the emerald tablet. It starts with saying, "As is above, so is below." That's the big motto of the Gnostics, the alchemists, the Hermeticists. The idea being that the world as we see below is a reflection of the things that operate in the macrocosm, right? Which is, by the way, the whole idea behind astrology. Stars are above us, they influence how we behave. As is above, so is below. That's the idea for the horoscopes, behind horoscopes, right? That things that are above are influencing our life down here. So Dante turns to, Faust turns to the spirit of the earth, the microcosmic being who overwhelms him, who represents nature essentially. That doesn't solve his problem. And then he turns to the supernatural. So that's kind of the journey that he has. And then again, going back to this idea of reaching some sort of perfect state. Well, the quest is for perfection. The quest is for both total knowledge, total experience, and I guess some sense of achieving what he currently lacks, which is he's totally dissatisfied. So he needs to have some sort of unity in his own being. He lacks that. And so he has to go through, he thinks that he's going to achieve it through experiencing certain things. And we're going to find out whether that is true or not. He's disillusioned with the academical, the theoretical knowledge. He is disillusioned with just sort of meditating on the macrocosm, or he knows he can't equate himself with the kind of the raw nature. He can't handle the raw nature when the spirit arrives. He's unable to process it. So now he's like, okay, I can't go up, I can't go down. Now the devil comes in, and the devil is going to say, okay, I'm going to lead you through the different experiences. That's kind of the setup, and that's sort of the linkage between the Hermetic, the alchemist, the Gnostic view of kind of the entire universe. So that's the philosophical. I would say that's the philosophical underpinnings of this. Is you have kind of the theoretical, the magical, the mystical, and then now you have supernatural with a certain limitlessness around it. That's the trajectory that we've gone kind of full circle, up, down, in the middle, and now we're going completely sideways in a different direction with devil as our guide, which I think is highly symbolic. Again, I keep coming back to the world we are experiencing today. It's almost, I would say it's very symbolic that we've kind of exhausted pretty much everything, and we're just kind of going in a very different trajectory, and who knows where it leads, but let's go fast anyway. So, Jan, did you have your hand up? Did you want to say something? You're muted again. Yeah. Okay, we'll keep going. Let's see. Was there anyone else? Oh, Joe. I skipped you first time around. Did you want to say something?
And, it's really kind of off topic. It's just something about the bargain itself. And I was just kind of thinking if, Faust's, nature, like notion of what heaven and hell are, is really kind of, not, it's kind of lost. And it seems like, I don't know what he's really risking by not taking that. And that's kind of, it was just something that I had thought about actually after Dimitri had spoken. But I do think what you just brought up with the idea of dealing with the universe and the individual soul is actually going to be something the most important part going forward, when you're talking about the macrocosm and the microcosm. So I had thought about that a little bit, but not enough to comment on it. I'm trying to think about what I would say on the fly, but I don't want to sound.
No, it's okay. I mean,
I think
when it
it's a
comes
really
up,
important point.
yeah, when you think of it, let's come back to it. I keep remembering things as we speak too. In alchemy, what you start out with is called materia prima, which is kind of like the primal matter, right? With the original matter. The Greeks considered a chaos to be that, right? Things in a state of chaos, disorganized. And alchemists, in the same vein, thought of it as something that is chaotic, that contains opposites, that contains irreconcilable conflicting substances. And when you read Faust, when we encounter Faust for the first time, I think it is prima materia par excellence. So he is very conflicted. He has incompatible desires. He wants the highest stars, the lowest lusts. He wants, to be out in nature. He longs for his childhood, some security within that. Easter morning, he kind of goes out. His heart goes out to that. So he's like torn in different directions. I mean, he is an ideal example of a prima materia. And then so alchemists would take that, and then they would try to mold it in different ways, which is to say, you apply different pressure or heat or elements to see how this material changes. And then ultimately it becomes gold, right? You reach that perfect state to gold, you purify it from all the dross, and then the next step is you take it even further with to the lapis philosophorum, the philosopher's stone. So that's again another picture of Faust, where we find him in this chaotic state, and then the ultimate, right, his bet with the devil is, you're not going to be able to lead me to this perfection. The moment I say stop moment, in other words, we're done here, we're finished, that's when I lose and you win, and you can do with me as you wish. And of course, as you mentioned, Joe, he doesn't care about what happens to his soul. He doesn't care about any of that, which is kind of, it's so different from Dante, right? Dante is all about soul. He is completely obsessed with how his soul, that's the whole point of the comedy, right? People are in hell, in purgatory, and in heaven. That's all about their souls, right? On a kind of a literal reading of it. Faust is completely unconcerned with that. He is absolutely oblivious to the soul. He doesn't care about it. He doesn't consider the consequences of that. All he cares about is his own experience. So that's a very stark contrast there.
So it's a reasonable wager. So it's a reasonable wager.
Yeah. Jan, how's your microphone?
Yeah, sorry about that. Can you hear me, guys?
Yep.
Yeah, just wanted to quickly follow up on Madeline's. We have several threads here, so we're kind of like running through them. On the so that the comments that were made about the language in the work, which I kind of didn't pay attention to, but now it's sort of staring me in the face, is that on the one hand, the devil says that we should basically the people are better off without the reason. On the other hand, there's a language about the reason being the greatest possession, and it sort of squarely puts the question as to the role of reason and what that is. And to me, the answer is not whether reason is good or bad. It's kind of like asking a very controversial question about whether guns are bad or good. I may have gotten too far, but it's the point here is it's what you do with it. It's not that you just have. By having it, you sort of solve all the problems. And so, yes, you do follow through using the reason, because this is the only tool we have, but the guidance doesn't come from the reason itself. That's my personal sort of, but I think that's the
interesting point. So the implication there, of course, is that you need some extra rational source of guidance. And that's kind of, if you look at all the religions, all the systems of culture, that's what they're all about, essentially. They're providing.
It's kind of why we make up our mind and then try to reason out why we do things the way we do.
Yep, for sure. Allison, go ahead.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, Madeline, I missed you. I apologize.
She can go ahead.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Sorry, Allison, I missed my spot.
Okay. Well, this is a comment on the same theme, which is the wager. So Faust is saying, I don't care. I want that one moment. I want that one moment when I completely lose myself in the vast chi of the world, to use a phrase from Taoism. So for him, the stakes don't even matter. He's the one who's proposed the wager. He's willing to give up anything just for that. It's like, okay, and then after that, and then as soon as that happens, please take me away, basically, because I don't want to come down from that high and come back to this. I just want to die just right then and there. The other wager, so he's proposed the wager himself. The other one is Mephistopheles' wager with God, which Mephistopheles has also proposed. I don't recall that there was any stake at all in that. Mephistopheles, I mean, maybe it's implied that Mephistopheles would take Faust's soul, but I think that the outcome of that wager is going to be knowledge gained about humankind and the value of learning. But who would gain that knowledge? I guess Mephistopheles, because presumably the all-powerful, all-knowing God that transcends space and time would already know the outcome. So this is just another part of his indulging games.
Yeah, this is a very interesting question, because in some ways, Mephistopheles doesn't strike me as this academic who's setting up experiments in a lab. He strikes me as a person who just does things for fun, kind of like a Joker-like figure almost. And I think what he gains from that wager, if he wins, is just the satisfaction of being right versus God. In other words, he kind of bested God in a way, and he kind of proves that he's superior to him. So maybe that's the other side of that wager, is not so much does he care about Faust's soul. I mean, he's got another 10 million souls coming anyway. I think it's more about the kind of the game. More about the game itself than the prize, I would almost say. Allison, and then Jan.
Yeah, this desire for to feel everything and at its most intense makes me think of manic depression. And I've known two people who had it, and they were always fighting about whether or not they should take their meds or not. And they said they really didn't like being on them, because even though, they didn't have these lows, they said the highs were so wonderful that it was worth risking it, but then the lows, sometimes it could be like they would get suicidal. But they said, even knowing that, to them, it was worth it, because they're like, you can't even imagine what these highs are like. So this I've
actually known somebody, I don't know if they were diagnosed with that exactly, but they definitely behaved like that. A person with very high highs and then very low lows. And I'm not sure if they well, I mean, obviously it's individual, but I'm not sure if they thought it was such a great bargain when they were in the low spot. Maybe when they were in the high spot, they thought it was kind
Yeah, I mean, it was
Um,
interesting. It was like two people I knew at very different times in my life, and they both said literally the exact same thing. And I was like, are you sure? I don't know about that, but
But you know, Allison, you hit up on a very, I think, very crucial point here. We kind of passed over it a little bit. I think Joe mentioned it and then Jan mentioned it. We have these people, kind of the crowd, that are kind of satisfied with life. They're not the subject of the play.
right.
In the beginning, when the director talks about the crowds that will come to watch the play, he's very condescending and maybe just being pragmatic and practical about it and realistic. He talks about the crowds going to, they read the newspaper, and then they go and they play the roulette, and then they might want to become a little cultured and watch an opera, and then they're going to go to the whorehouse, and it's just kind of this endless routine of kaleidoscope of experiences. And now we have the crowd as an actor in the play itself. And what are they like? Well, they're exactly like that. They just went to the church service, right? Where they sang hymns about the resurrection. And now they're out of the church, and what are they doing? They're flirting, and they're thinking of, kind of going out with girls and all this kind of stuff, very frivolous. And it's meant to be, right? It's meant to be kind of very vivacious and frivolous. It's not, and Goethe doesn't, I don't think he portrays it as being hypocritical in any way, but more kind of like just a real life experience. And yet they're very happy. They're not after stars from heaven. They're not after some experience. They're kind of in the middle. In other words, they're not living this life of infinity and beyond. They're living a life of everything in moderation. Now, is that the perfect way to live? I mean, this is such a pertinent question for me, because I have friends and relatives who live exactly like that. And when I try to challenge them a little bit, they're like, well, you live like, you do you, and I'll do me, and who's to say they're wrong, There are people who live in metropolitan areas, and they're very condescending towards the country people in the suburbs. They're like, what do these guys do? Like, they just go out to bars and do nothing all day long. They just work, and like, what's their like? What's that all about? People in the country will be, well, we're happy. What's your problem? So these questions, they're so perennial. And I'm sure in the German village of the time, there were people who were just enjoying life, and that's what they are, like the hobbits, And then you have the elves and the.
You took the words right out of my mouth.
The
I was going to go.
hobbits,
I was going to go right to the hobbits.
Back to the
Actually,
hobbits, yeah. The hobbits.
Back to the Shire.
The Shire, yeah. A beer. Who needs the stars from heaven? Who needs this? Who needs this learning? Let's just have a good time. Is that the flourishing life? Is that something to aspire to? I mean, it's like an open question. Obviously, I don't have an answer. One more point before we go to Madeline. I think Madeline. No, Jan. Sorry, I keep. So yeah.
Yeah. Am I on the air?
You're next. 1 second. Just if you remember when Faust had trapped Mephistopheles had this army of little spirits who put him to kind of sang him a little lullaby and put him to sleep, almost kind of hypnotized him. I was thinking this, there's so many things in this life that hypnotize us and prevent us from reaching beyond what we have. This is right alongside the Brave New World and the idea that we have drugs, we have ways to kind of change us mentally so that we're operating within this bounded condition. But the spirits in this play, they kind of function as that. They affected Faust. He fell asleep. They put all kinds of happy thoughts and happy images in his head. I mean, this is like a perfect illustration of drugs, I think, in some ways. And then he wakes up and realizes, okay, it's all gone. It was all an illusion. It was nothing. But the question is still there. If you are asleep and you see happy images and thoughts, is that good enough? If you, as long as you're happy, is that better than being awake, miserable, and conflicted? So, Jan, you're up.
Yeah, I just got one line about the wager between Mephistos and God. I think the wager has very great consequences. If the devil can pick a random person or seemingly ostensibly learned one and lead him to anywhere he wants, then how good is God? That's the wager.
Oh, can I comment really quickly?
Go ahead, Joe.
I think the wager's, profound between God and Mephistopheles. I don't think it's particularly a risk for Faust. That's my thought.
Can you expand? Sorry, can you expand on that?
Well, essentially, Faust has no belief in heaven or hell or anything about that. So his, whatever he's just seeking was that one moment. So, his notions of what he believes to be true, are completely. Whereas I think with the bet between Mephistopheles and God, that is the difference between, like, all right, what is God's influence over humanity? Is it essentially are they searching for essentially, are they searching for, how do I best say this? Are they searching for redemption or not? And that's a very deep point, because if they're not, then that's kind of not, basically this is the battle between good and evil. That's my thought.
Right.
A little bit all over the place, but
well, that's the kind of curious part about it all. Faust is definitely doesn't strike you as a sort of like materialist atheist guy. I mean, he is right there conjuring up spirits. He doesn't doubt that Mephistopheles is in fact a devil. I mean, he realizes that when he traps him, that the pentagrammaton that traps Mephistopheles is the inscription of Jesus, in the name Jesus in Hebrew. It's a rendering of the Hebrew version of the name Jesus. So obviously there's something there, right? So he could kind of guess that there's some real force behind all of this that's happening. So he's definitely not a materialist, and yet at the same time he doesn't seem to care, right? I mean, he behaves like it doesn't really matter as long as it's kind of fun. God, devil, I mean, Buddha, whatever. I mean, and I think, again, this is such a good portrayal of the modern world, right? It's not about some sort of principled stance. It's more about kind of the fluidity of whatever happens. And Goethe portrays it in a beautiful way. Like it's a perfect portrayal of the world we're in today. And I guess the world that he already saw happening even at that time. I mean, it's gotten much more fluid now, but the principles are still exactly the same. According to Spengler, this is kind of who we started with in the last time. According to Spengler, this Faustian age that we're in today is basically in its decline and pretty much going out. So it would be very interesting to see whether or not this plays out in our lifetime, or if in fact he's right or wrong. But that's the idea, is that you can't ultimately, this idea of life without limits doesn't really work. And we're kind of already seeing that in some ways. There was some talk about the atomic bomb,
right,
the virus, the pandemic. I mean, we're kind of seeing how it works, right? The more you know, the more things can destroy you, right? The more avenues for self-destruction you have. So knowledge brings that double-edged sword. It gives you more power over nature, but that same power over nature is able to bring us to nothing because we are part of nature. So power over nature is power over ourselves. And then it's not about, limitlessness is not such a great thing at that point. You want to have some limits, like a car without brakes, right? Everybody does, no, everybody realizes that going fast is really cool, except
Right.
when there's a brick wall in front of you. Then you need brakes and you need some limits. So anyway, do we have anyone else who wants to say any? Doug, go
Doug.
ahead.
That's a great point.
Doug, you're muted.
You're muted.
Doug, you're muted, sorry.
I unmuted, then I muted again.
Oh,
I think Faust cares, but in Goethe's sense of theater and life, he can't stay fixed or committed to anything for very long. Things change. I mean, that the show it begins on the eve of Easter, and then the Easter hymns come in. He says, "Oh, that's wonderful. It takes me back to my childhood. And I feel so rich. I feel so good." And then they're doing the mass somewhere, and suddenly he focuses on this vial. And then I realize the vial is like almost a parody of the mass, and he gets distracted from the mass that's going on to this vial, which I began to wonder, what is this vial? Is it ambrosia? Is it a?
no, it's poison.
It's an opiate. Oh, it's a poison.
It's a poison,
Yeah.
and it's like Mephistopheles alludes to it. It says, by the way, you didn't kill yourself. You were going to, but you didn't. So yeah, he is on the verge of committing suicide because.
Well, and it's even more of a parody of a mass because he's going to drink something that's going to wipe him out and not bring him life. So, but that vial, the timing of that vial at the end of this religious thing, I actually began to associate it with whiskey, which actually means the water of life and is based on alchemical kind of distillations. And it can also kill you, but it's like, because the way alcohol pops in, which can be a poison or it can be, I have to go back and look at that section. That's what I mean. I mean, I get you sort of there's so much there. It's easy to get distracted.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
But I think he's like committed to something, and this is the truth. And this is what good medicine is. Well, I don't practice it. And so he gets depressed, and then he gets committed to something else, and then he gets depressed. I think it's like he has ADHD. And I think Poe actually points this out with great poems, that there are no such thing as a long work of poetry, that the mechanism gets exhausted by the high state of poetry. So what appears to be a long poem is a sequence of short poems, things that can be digested in one evening, like you read a book of Paradise Lost. You don't swallow it whole. You get excited about this part of the book, and then you rest, because Poe actually had a very clear feeling that poetic inflation was exhausting to the soul, which fits into this manic depression discussion. The highs are exhausting. They will take you down.
Right.
And Poe actually writes about that there are no, it actually influenced me in the writing of the Bucky plays, that turning that whole long poem into a series of short poems. It's about 100 poems, actually, the play. So some are comic, some are serious, some are philosophical, some are historical, some are vaudevillian, some are songs, some are jokes. But it's that eclectic kind of blend that keeps people attracted.
Interesting. Thank you, Doug. Ella.
Yeah, just a couple of thoughts on the opening act with the Lord and the three angels and the devil. Mephisto enters. He can't sing. He doesn't know the songs. And so he really, I wonder if he is being deceptive, but I don't know. That could be just due to my own conditioning that I'm seeing it that way. But it's interesting how God accepts the devil, and converses with them, and you know, they have a decent conversation about what's going on earth. The devil even says he's a little concerned about how mankind is all involved in reason and intellect and so forth. But God feels that, you know, Faust is going to be okay. And I kind of like that. He has faith in him. He says, but he does say, men make mistakes when striving. And I think that's kind of key, because striving, well, that sort of takes me on two journeys. The one we discussed before about going deeper into the soul, into a transpersonal journey, past the ego, et cetera, or from the Eastern point of view, you know, going into that, you know, selflessness, you know, beyond striving even to do, to act, to learn, as Faust was doing, to acquire more degrees, whatever the case may be, or even to meditate, to just get beyond the striving into the peace, the quiet, the light. So that's.
Thank you, Ellie. Yeah, that's an interesting way to for us to finish. We've got a little bit past our time. I think it was a great discussion today. I think we did justice to the reading, so I think we will just keep with the schedule as is for the next time. So just keep reading based on our schedule. I think next time we go up to not including Walpurgis Night, so everything up to Walpurgis Night, and we will see you in 2 weeks. Hope you enjoy. Thanks everyone for the discussion. It was great. Good to discuss these things, and I think we're learning a lot together, and that's the best way to do it. All right.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Phil. This was awesome.
Oh, brilliant.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank
Great
you,
comments from
everyone.
everyone.